The laughter cracked like ice over a river that had been quiet too long, and then the sound bent sideways into something meaner. A hand rose, a word snapped, and the night swallowed its echo so completely that even the neon seemed to hold its breath. No one moved at first. A ring of faces flickered in the barlight, drawn moth close to a heat they didn't want to claim. Someone muttered it was a misunderstanding. Another made a joke he didn't finish. The air smelled of diesel, lime, and old apologies. A storm prowled beyond the lot, waiting for the town to decide what it was made of. Blue strobes turned the gravel into a pulse. Tires hissed. A door thudded open, deliberate, and with it came the certainty that secrets would finally speak, whether anyone liked the shape of their words. She didn't cry. He didn't either. But the silence that followed belonged to her, and the law that stepped into it belonged to blood. Morning scraped in through cheap blinds, ruthless and ordinary, making a tapestry of stripes across the kitchen where a plate of toast went cold beside a glass of water. No one drank. The house behaved like it always had, pipes knocking, floorboards popping. Yet everything spoke a half-inch louder, as if even the drywall knew what had been said without words. Voices tried gentleness and kept tripping. There were bargains tucked into the butter dish, calls to make, stories to arm against other stories, the measured use of silence. A memory of last night hung from the ceiling fan and turned slowly with the blades. Someone reached for humor and found the edge of grief instead. Someone else rehearsed forgiveness with their teeth clenched, as though forgiveness were a task done in the backyard with a dull shovel. The day was barely awake and already crowding everyone into corners they pretended not to see. At the station, the coffee tasted like burnt pennies and resolve. Paperwork stacked itself into a fortress while the clock dragged its feet, and the chair beneath the fluorescent lights remembered every weary person who had ever confessed, denied, or simply endured. Questions came in pairs. What happened, and what will you say happened? Both carrying a price. The room kept its promises. Nothing left it without a copy. Yet the heart kept its own records, inked in places forms never reached. There was a moment when the pen hung above the signature line and time parted like a curtain. Beyond it lived outcomes. A job lost, a reputation rearranged, a family map redrawn with new rivers and erased roads. The pen touched down. The sound was small. It echoed anyway. Outside, a siren passed, indifferent and perfectly on key. News travels here the way rain does, finding every seam. By afternoon, the hardware store clerk spoke in hushed italics, and the diner refilled mugs with a kindness sharpened by curiosity. Loyalty was a weather that shifted across faces. Some looked away. Others stared too long, measuring their own houses by the crack in someone else. A cousin from the far branch called to say prayer in a tone that felt like inventory. A voicemail arrived that mistook advice for love. Underneath it all, a small relief crept in. The thing that had been happening had happened where witnesses could not pretend to be fog. Relief made guilt. Guilt made a quiet, prickly strength. The town, for all its chatter, had never learned what to do when a woman simply stood still and let facts arrange themselves around her. Evening curled back to the house with the scent of cut grass and coming rain. A toolbox thumped shut in the garage like a period at the end of a sentence no one liked. The porch light clicked on early, making a small, safe island that didn't quite reach the steps. Conversations tried to find their shape and failed, then tried again, softer. Apologies sat between people like furniture too heavy to move without scraping the floor. Somewhere, a radio played a song that had once meant summer, and now meant something else entirely. When thunder finally spoke, it was gentle. A reminder that storms aren't only fury, but also relief. There was talk of tomorrow. There was talk of tomorrow, and in the thin place between those two, a vow formed. Not the kind made out loud, but the kind that anchors itself to bone and waits for the courage of morning. The courthouse smelled like paper and rain-damp wool, and the hallway clocks refused to hurry, as if time itself were a clerk guarding the door to consequence. He was somewhere behind a wall, converting bravado into math, charges into days, days into calls, calls into a version of the story that could survive fluorescent light. She sat with hands folded too neatly, discovering how stillness could be a blade. The cousin who wore a badge kept her voice flat enough to stack files on. Careful to let procedure walk ahead. Careful not to let family step on its heels. People pretended to study their shoes while their ears leaned in. A cough, a scuffed sole, the weight of the town pivoting on a hinge that squeaked. A judge's name was spoken like weather. There would be a piece of paper that promised distance, and a date stamped in black that promised scrutiny. Promises were fragile, but so was the old silence. Something had to break. Home again, the clock above the stove measured a quieter trial, the cross-examination of memory. A cupboard door, dented years ago, volunteered as witness. The pantry swallowed a shouted apology from another winter and returned it as a dull thud in the ears. She opened a shoebox filled with receipts that had once been proofs of care. Dinners, flowers, oil changes, and watched them curl back to their ordinary paper hearts. A voicemail blinked with the familiar rhythm of someone who always knew when to leave words instead of listening. The mother moved slowly, as if every movement petitioned the room for mercy. The brother scrubbed a counter already clean, trying to sand down a helplessness that refused to change shape. When the phone finally rang with the official voice, it was both relief and summons. There would be statements to add to statements. A plan for sleep. A plan for the kind of fear that sneaks in wearing reason's clothes. The garage carried the truthful smell of solvent and heat. A steadier theology than gossip. He lay under a car, spine pressed to concrete, when footsteps idled at the threshold and laughter tried to pretend it belonged to another day. The friends who had watched wore the heaviness of spectatorship poorly. It slid off them and puddled at their feet. Words were offered like spare parts. Light, interchangeable, not built to carry weight. He rolled out, stood up in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be named, and let anger pick its tools. There is a craft to drawing a line without crossing it. Keep the voice low, the distance exact, the exit clear. Somewhere, a radio narrated a ball game with the optimism of summer. Somewhere else, a dog barked because dogs understand thresholds. In the end, there was no swing, only a promise that loyalty would not be measured by how well you looked away. Paper can feel heavier than metal when it carries the right signature. At the station, policy stacked itself like sandbags against the flood of opinion. The cousin removed the hat she wore, in rooms that demanded certainty, and stared at a form that asked if blood might bias bone. Supervisors spoke in lacquered phrases. Appearance of impropriety, recusal, transfer. Each one a careful fence post driven into soggy ground. She could count the times family had been a shield. This would not be one. She wrote a sentence that tasted like copper and duty, then another that tilted toward care without naming it. Outside, the flag luffed against a shy wind. Inside, the copy machine warmed to its task, making twins of everything. When the forms slid into the out tray, something loosened in her shoulders. The job would still be the job, and love would have to find other ways to be true. Night arrived with the exactness of a verdict. The porch light scribed its small circle again, but the air beyond it felt rearranged, as if the map had been shaken and some roads no longer met. The order, ink, stamp, promise, sat on the table inside like a talisman that worked only if believed in together. Tires whispered once on the far end of the street, and then were gone, or imagined, which can be worse. She stood at the window and practiced the breathing taught by people who have seen many nights. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6, The math of staying present. A shadow twitched where a hedgerow leaned, only the wind. Then the soft chirr of a phone. He was out, pending this and that. Conditions shaped like a fence with missing boards. The cousin texted one word, here, followed by nothing, which somehow weighed more. She drew the curtains and chose to sleep anyway. Sunday morning gathered itself into careful, quiet pews, varnished with the shine of many small gilts. Hymns moving like a river that never quite reaches the sea. Eyes lifted, then slid away, then returned. The choreography of a town deciding who it was when asked aloud. She felt the weight of 100 prayers that sounded like advice, the soft-voiced arithmetic of forgiveness offered at a discount if she would just make it easier to carry. A child kicked a songbook. The sound rang truer than the adult hush that followed. Somewhere behind her, 2 whispers braided into a rumor and found purchase, the way Ivy does. Not malicious at first, just hungry. She kept breathing until the organ's final note trembled and stood there a moment longer, outlasting it. Outside, light spilled across the steps with the authority of weather. A hand touched her elbow and withdrew, meaning well and not knowing how. Even Faith, she understood, had a learning curve. Across town, the rented house wore a badge of compliance, a plastic anklet blinking like a stubborn star. He stood in a room stripped of swagger, taking inventory of the furniture that wasn't his and the silence that finally was. The friends who had laughed that night came by with takeout and unsure eyes, speaking in the adverbs of obligation. Probably, maybe, just. While the television tried to launder the day with sports, he offered a version of the story that put heat where impact had been, accident where choice had stood, and no one corrected him outright. It was too early for courage. When the door closed behind them, the humming ankle and the refrigerator negotiated who would own the dark. He remembered, against his will, the look that had not asked for pity. It didn't leave him. He turned up the volume until the commentators drowned it and found it still floating when the commercials went quiet. The kitchen table turned courtroom again at dusk, this time for history. As a witness, the mother set down a chipped sugar bowl and spoke in the careful meter of someone crossing a river on stones she once swore never to touch again. Years unspooled. A slammed door that had become a family landmark. A winter bruise disguised as a fall. An uncle who could quiet an argument by saying the word, "Enough, the way thunder says it." The cousin listened without the uniform between them, phone face down, spine upright, letting silence mark the places where the record had gaps. He paced, then sat, then knotted a dish towel into certainty. No one raised a voice. They let the past do that. When it finished, the house expanded a half-inch, as if exhaling. Blame didn't change addresses tonight, but responsibility did. The mother reached for her daughter's hand, found it, and didn't let go until the tea had gone cold. Truth arrived on a thumb drive, indifferent and exact. In the dim of an evidence room, pixels assembled a night already lived, each frame a small refusal to forget. The slap, the flinch, the hollow laughter trying to make a shelter out of denial, the crowd's faces lit in carnival colors, the law walking into the shot like a line drawn in wet sand that somehow didn't wash away. They watched, then watched again with the sound off, as if quiet could change meaning. Outside that room, the town's rumor mill found a leak, then a link, and by sundown, 1,000 thumbs had replayed impact as if repetition could soften it. She didn't read the comments. She told herself that twice, then a third time, and let the vow hold. The cousin wrote a report with verbs that carried weight. Somewhere, a printer spit out a plea deal proposal. Somewhere else, resolve sharpened its edge. Night folded in with crickets and a wind that knew which fences needed testing. The porch light made its patient circle. Beyond it, the yard lay in the kind of dark that keeps its own counsel. She found the envelope wedged under the mat. No return address, her name wrong by one letter. Inside, a photograph from the bar angle. Her face still, his hand blurred, clipped from a printout and creased twice. No threat written, which made it speak louder. She set it on the table beside the order that was supposed to hold the perimeter and listened to the refrigerator stutter into a new cycle. The cousin arrived without siren, the cruiser's engine ticking down, and together they read the blankness as fluently as text. Somewhere, a car idled and eased away, embarrassed by its own cowardice. They didn't chase, they documented. Then, in a hush that felt like pact, they pulled the shades and left one lamp burning, a small lighthouse set stubbornly to on. By noon, the aisles of the supermarket performed their weekly ritual. Carts nudging, coupons unfolding, gossip priced as 2 for 1, and she moved through it with the concentration of someone disarming a room. The video had given strangers the confidence of witnesses. They offered nods that felt like signatures and soft phrases shaped like medals. Brave, strong, proud of you. Each one a weight that wanted to live in her pockets. Near the oranges, a woman said she'd been there and folded the words back into her purse before they could mean more. At checkout, the bagger avoided her eyes and stacked cans with reverence, as if gravity had a new rule. Her phone vibrated with a number she didn't recognize, then again, then stilled. Silence, she learned, has a pulse. Outside, the sky cleared to the exact blue the town uses for forgiveness, and she stood a moment under it, letting light sort truth from spectacle. Somewhere, a cart rattled free and coasted toward her, harmless, inevitable. The flowers arrived at dusk like an argument that had dressed itself as apology. Store-bought lilies, their sweetness heavy. The card unsigned but printed with a florist's stamp from 3 blocks west of the exclusion line. She didn't touch them. The cousin examined the ribbon and the receipt, the way a medic checks an old wound for new lies, and dialed a number that turned into another. Then a judge's clerk who spoke in the firm voice of policy. Across town, he stared at his phone as if it were a door that could be made to forget. It was locked. The friends texted advice that sounded like weather reports. Storm moving off. Hold steady, you'll be fine. Each message an umbrella with holes. When the knock came on his rental, it wasn't handcuffs. Not yet. Only a voice reminding him that, through a third party, still counts as a breach. He laughed once, short and dry, and called it a misunderstanding. The lilies kept opening. Court again, this time for the fine print. The hallway smelled of toner and old carpet. A bulletin warned against phones, food, and forgetting your case number. He stood behind a podium that made adults into children, a lawyer at his elbow translating consequences into syllables small enough to swallow. She sat 3 rows back between her mother and the kind of stranger who shows up to hearings as if civic duty were a hobby. The new prosecutor spoke without ornament, and the judge listened like rain listens to roofs. Steady, testing for leaks. The violation by lilies turned into a discussion of intent, of distance measured in feet and in nerve, of whether silence had been asked for and answered. A modification was drafted, read aloud in a tone that left no place for the word misunderstood. He signed with a flourish that pretended not to shake. As they filed out, the stranger squeezed her shoulder and didn't speak, which felt like the truest kindness all day. At home, dinner went cold under lids that trapped more steam than comfort. The brother's fork clicked against a plate like a metronome for anger. The mother rearranged napkins as if order could be set by linen alone. The cousin, off duty, laid her badge on the table between salt and pepper. A small moon everyone orbited without naming. He wanted action made of verbs with teeth. She wanted a morning without strategy. The cousin wanted compliance to do what love could not. Old patterns knocked, asking to be let in. The family way of converting fear into humor. The reflex to take blame in as a lodger because it was tidier than waiting for justice to keep hours. When the storm outside finally opened, it felt like permission to raise voices. They didn't. Instead, they divided tasks into lists that made a scaffolding: calls, locks, lights, neighbors. In the quiet after, she said a sentence with her whole spine in it. "I'm not going back to before." The town fair lit up the riverbank with Ferris wheel stars and the smell of frying sugar. The kind of night where memory poses as mercy. She went because not going would concede too much ground to a story that wasn't finished with her. Children ran feral between booths. A cover band worked hard to remind everyone of summers they hadn't had. She kept to the edges, ritualizing normal. Lemonade. A ring toss. A laugh that belonged to now. Then he appeared at the far edge of the crowd, ankle blinking like a distant buoy. The perimeter line a suggestion dissolving under noise. He didn't move closer, but the sight of him undid a knot she had just retied. The cousin, already scanning, radioed calm while a state trooper traced the map with firmer lines. The approach was textbook, the request to leave precise. The citation crisp. He smiled a kind of dare and backed away. Not brave, not beaten. She stood her ground, breath steady, and let the wheel turn. Morning came edged like paper. She found the day already speaking in rituals. Coffee measured, blinds tilted, keys set precisely where they could not be lost. Because order today was a way of not letting fear decide the plot. The town's chatter had cooled into something steadier. Not sympathy, not outrage. Just the hum of people making room for a new fact. A letter lay on the mat, official and unsentimental, offering diversion programs and classes with titles that made harm sound like curriculum. She read to the end and felt an unexpected ache for all the right words that still could not lift weight. The cousin texted a time, the mother set out toast, the brother paced, and the clock refused dramatics, choosing to tick like any other day. She wondered what would be left when this was finished, what habits would survive, which friendships would molt into silence, how the version of herself that stood up last week might learn to stand without adrenaline. Outside, the sky practiced ordinary blue. The class met in a room that had known many apologies. Its whiteboard carried faint ghosts of arrows connecting impulse to outcome. Chairs squeaked their agreement with the premise that change is a practice, not a speech. He sat at the far left, posture disciplined like he could outstare regret. A facilitator spoke in verbs that didn't moralize. Pause, identify, choose, and the men around him mapped their histories in careful, unheroic detail. When his turn came, he built a story from passive constructions, then corrected himself, one sentence at a time, until a subject finally attached to a verb that didn't flinch. In the silence after, a window unit sighed and the fluorescent light buzzed like a stubborn conscience. He thought of the laughter outside the bar, of the way a hand looks when it belongs to a moment that you can't cut away from. Somewhere in him, a hinge loosened, small and unfancy. It didn't absolve. It simply opened. At the garage, work made sense in ways people didn't. Torque meets resistance, heat yields. The stubborn bolt moves if you know where to lean. He arrived with a mouthful of phrases that wanted to be fences, but the brother met him with a silence that had tensile strength. The apology landed without ornament, its edges blunt, its center honest enough to sting, and for a moment both men let the air hold them up because they weren't ready to trust the floor. They spoke in nouns, tools, rent, schedules, safe things that could be lifted without breaking. Then the brother, voice low, gave shape to a boundary so clear it almost glowed. Help is not the same as forgetting. Presence is not permission. The day outside went on being day. A customer needed breaks. The radio found an old song and refused to turn it into nostalgia. They shook hands like people testing a bridge. It held. Not much, just enough for one step. The kitchen gathered them that evening like a jury reconvened, not for verdict but for terms. The mother set down bowls of stew, as if feeding were a sacrament with proofs. The cousin arrived crisp in uniform, Duty, it seemed, could share a table with tenderness if everyone agreed to mind their elbows. Papers came out. Conditions, calendars, a victim impact statement, drafted in the unsleeping hours, and revised now to keep anger from doing the talking. She read it aloud and found her voice steadier than she expected. The sentences set like bricks. No one interrupted. In the pauses, the house made its domestic music. Ice machine, porch hinge, a neighbor's laugh rising through the window screen. When she finished, they sat inside the quiet that follows a truth well spoken. The cousin nodded once. The brother squeezed her shoulder. The mother blinked long, and she felt something rearrange inside. A spine of new habits aligning. A map redrawn without erasing the rivers that had flooded. Night drifted toward the river, and the town's lights stitched a careful seam along the water. She walked the path where summer used to mean only cicadas and the sweet rot of fallen apples, and let the new quiet try itself on like a coat that might yet fit. Somewhere behind her, a door closed in a way that sounded like understanding, not defeat. Her phone stayed in her pocket, heavy with unfinished conversations she was no longer auditioning for. On the far bank, the fairgrounds emptied into trucks and tired laughter. The Ferris wheel turned once more for no one. She thought of all the versions of herself she'd retired this month, and all the ones waiting their cue. It wasn't triumph. It was simply the math of mornings added together. The river kept its counsel. She kept hers. When she reached the bend where you can see the whole town at once, she stopped, counted her breaths, and decided not to narrate the rest out loud. Morning leaned against the house like a question that refused to be simplified. The printed statement waited on the table with all its verbs sharpened, lines marked for breath, where breath might fail. She read it once, aloud to an empty room, feeling how each sentence carried a freight that paper couldn't show. The nights arranged by weather instead of sleep. The way a door sounds when you learn it from the inside. The refrigerator hummed in sympathy. The clock rehearsed endurance. Outside, the town rehearsed ordinary. Trash trucks, school buses, a dog insisting on its route, while she practiced the parts of the truth that did not ask permission to exist. Somewhere, a neighbor's radio tried a cheerful song and didn't quite nail it. She smoothed the pages as if removing wrinkles from a dress worn to a hard occasion, and thought about the moment when eyes would find her. Not just hers, but his, and all their borrowed witnesses. The words didn't soften. They steadied. The shop smelled like brake dust and something older. A mineral truth that didn't care about anyone's storyline. He arrived without swagger, holding the kind of apology that can't choose between standing and kneeling. The friend behind the counter lifted his chin, measuring whether the day could hold a confession without breaking. Then it came. The flowers weren't a ghost's idea, but a favor promised over beers. A no big deal that had learned the size of itself too late. The words fell heavy, clattered, kept rolling until they lodged against consequences with names. Anger flared and found the curb. A hand landed on wood instead of someone's face. The air thinned and then remembered how to work. Lines were drawn with a grease pencil, literal on a calendar and figurative on the floor. And the price of being a friend was recalculated in full daylight. When the bell over the door sighed again, it let out the smell of rain, and something like honesty, unglamorous, remained. Evening broke power like a twig. The block slipped into candlelight and battery glow, shadows climbing the walls with long, quiet legs. In the hush, a knock arrived that knew the door by heart. The rulebook in her chest flipped to the right page. She did not open anything but her breath. Presence lived on the other side of the wood. Familiar cadence. The pause before a name. The bargain disguised as calm. She texted one word and set the phone down face up where courage could see it. Tires whispered up the street. Radio spoke softly. The kind of order that doesn't raise its voice took its place on the porch. Through the peephole, a world narrowed to an eye and a badge, and a man who couldn't decide which direction he belonged to. The neighborhood pretended to water plants, to fold laundry near windows, to be accidental witnesses. What might have become a reenactment became procedure, then paperwork, then a breath let go that had been held too long. The courtroom tasted of coffee and dusted wood polish, a familiar flavor of accountability. Papers shuffled themselves into outcomes while the clock took pride in being exact. He stood where people stand when they're learning the cost of a single second. She sat in the geography of resolve, pages warm from her hands. The judge's voice ran clean. The prosecutor arranged facts like stones. The defense reached for context that did not erase contact. When she read, the room leaned forward without moving. The words were not knives. They were a map with hazards circled and distances marked, a promise to the person she had to be. He did not look away this time. When it ended, penalties were spoken in a language of supervision and hours owed to a community that had watched and will keep watching. It wasn't victory. It was architecture. As people rose, the benches exhaled, and the town adjusted the fit of its conscience by a notch. Night returned the power with a shy click, and the house brightened as if embarrassed by its own darkness. Dinner warmed on a low flame. The dog, 2 houses down, resumed his commentary on the moon. The papers were filed, the order amended, the dates inked where they could be seen by anyone who needed keeping honest. They didn't toast. They stacked plates. They stood on the porch while cicadas braided a steady sound from all the frayed threads of the week. Plans were made not for war, but for weather, locks checked, routes shared, numbers memorized, sleep attempted. In the yard, a sprinkler ticked a small metronome for patience. She pictured the river at the bend and the wheel silent on its axis, waiting for another summer to give it a reason. The story hadn't ended. It had been re-engineered. Inside, the statement lay back in its folder. Done being a weapon, beginning to be a record. The house, at last, remembered how to be a home. Morning wore the town like a well-mended sweater, seams visible but holding. The edges of the week had softened into routines that didn't apologize for being ordinary. A kettle scolded itself into steam. A truck coughed awake 2 doors down. A mail slot learned the weight of peace. She moved through rooms that now remembered how to be rooms, not stages. The walls had stopped listening for raised voices and returned to holding pictures. Every object felt newly named. A cup for thirst that wasn't panic. A key that locked for the sake of sleeping well. A window whose job was only light. Messages arrived and were allowed to wait. Outside, the street practiced a gentler choreography. Wave, nod, keep walking. And she discovered that there is a bravery quieter than testimony. Staying. There would still be paperwork and weather, and the occasional rumor that mistook itself for news. But the house had a spine again, and so did she. When a breeze found the doorway, it did not ask permission. It came in like kin. The garage settled into the patient liturgy of labor. Bolts surrendering on the 3rd try, belts singing at the right tension, a radio murmuring a game that wasn't asking anyone to be a hero. He arrived during the slow hour, a shadow lengthening the threshold before voice followed. The room seemed to hold its wrench-laden breath. What passed between the men had no poetry to it, and that was the gift. A ledger balanced, a debt named without dramatics, a promise to be small enough not to harm. Outside, tires hissed on damp asphalt, and across the street, a kid on a bike learned the physics of braking without flipping the world. Then the talk shifted to knuckles and rotors, cheap coffee and winter salt, the low geography of days you can finish proud of. Some bridges hold by being crossed slowly, the boards talking to one another as weight moves. No one shook hands. They simply returned to the work and let the air decide what to remember. At the station, paper continued its sober march. But elsewhere, something more elastic took shape. The badge went on as always, the oath as practical as boots. Yet the rooms felt less like rooms and more like instruments tuned to a clearer pitch. She wrote a memo that did what memos rarely do. Invite not just compliance but curiosity, and pinned it where policy meets practice. The call log blinked its usual errands of human trouble. Some could be solved, some only witnessed well. In a quiet minute, she stood by the window and watched the town move in smaller, kinder units. A pair walking a dog, a delivery driver handing up a package to a porch where someone waved thanks with both hands. She thought about the tightrope between family and law, and how the trick was not balance but belonging to both without lying to either. The radio cleared its throat. She answered, voice even, not lighter, not heavier, just more true. Evening found them at the river's bend where the town can see itself without flinching. The wheel stood quiet on the far bank, a patient skeleton against blush blue dusk. They walked without agenda, letting silence do its competent work, stitching, sanding, sealing. A bird skimmed the water and did not bother to name its grace. They spoke of small things first. How tomatoes were late this year, whether the bakery would keep the lemon bars on Fridays, and in those ordinary syllables lived the repair. Then came the bigger nouns. Set down gently. Trust like a bridge you test each crossing. Love like a verb that sweeps and salts steps before a storm. Future like a road you don't have to take alone. The wind lifted, and with it, a memory that used to make hands tremble. Now, it made them steadier. When they turned back, the path was the same length but shorter to walk, as if the earth had learned their names and wanted them home. Night settled like a final chord, held just long enough to prove it wasn't an accident. The house breathed with them. A screen door admitting breeze, a clock content with its simple math, a lamp shading a circle generous enough for 4. On the table lay the folder that had once felt like armor. Now it read like history, not prophecy. They ate late and badly and laughed anyway. Somewhere a neighbor's TV tried the news and gave up for a movie where endings mean to be neat. They didn't aim for neat. They aimed for honest, and the way honest sometimes messes the counters. Before bed, she stepped onto the porch and stared at the unremarkable street, the heroic smallness of it. Recycling bins aligned, a cat deciding the route, a sky big with indifferent stars. She thought of the first silence and the last word, and how in between there is a life made of choices shaped like doors. Behind her, someone called her in. She went and left the door open.